Good morning, all. Welcome to the final Carsey Policy Hour of the year. We are ending the year with a bang, hosting Jean Martin from the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute for a discussion on economic insecurity in New Hampshire. The Carsey Policy Hour, of course, is our monthly discussion series for people passionate about the issues and policies that are shaping Granite State communities. My name is UC Terrell, and in addition to hosting the series, I serve as the training director for Carsey's Center for Impact Finance. As folks are entering today, please type your name and organization in the chat so we know who's here today. As always, your questions and comments are welcome throughout the presentations and discussion. I'll include as many as I can in that discussion, and we'll also follow up with the recording and slides. Thank you, as always, to our partners at New Hampshire's Bureau of Education and Training. The BET's Certified Public Manager Program feeds into the Carsey School's master's programs in public administration, public policy, community development, and global conflict and human security. And also to our partners at the New Hampshire Municipal Association. NHMA works to strengthen New Hampshire cities and towns and promotes effective municipal government through education, training, advocacy, and legal services. Gene Wilson is someone who could speak on any number of topics. I asked him to think about a topic of personal importance to him, a passion presentation, if you will. It's no surprise that he picked economic insecurity, responding in part to the common misperception that because New Hampshire is one of the wealthiest states in the nation, poverty is at the fringe of our social and policy priorities and effects. Jean is the fourth executive director of the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, and we are in our state fortunate to have the Fiscal Policy Institute, founded in 2009, excuse me. It's an independent, nonpartisan organization dedicated to exploring, developing, and promoting public policies that foster economic opportunity and prosperity for all New Hampshire residents, with an emphasis on low and moderate income families and individuals. The Carsey School, of course, shares many of these research interests, and we are looking forward to a dynamic conversation today at the intersection of these issues: applied research in healthcare, childcare, housing, economic development, climate equity, rural America, education, and the demographic shifts that underpin all of these. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Gene to introduce himself and share his presentation with us.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me here. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today. Jean Martin, Executive Director, as noted, of the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute, graduate of the Carsey School in 2020. It was an interesting time to, walk across the stage virtually with that, but really had a great experience with the program and have worked in state government in the state senate and sort of staffed key committees, worked in higher education, and now I've been at the Policy Institute for just under 2 years. And so excited to sort of talk a little bit about something that I care about, and sort of, I don't know about you, but when I get together with friends and colleagues, sort of, we talk about the struggles that folks are having individually or sort of that we see in the community. So excited to jump right in. To start off, I think I'll just sort of note, I know you did a little bit, but I always like to try to do some disclaimers about the Fiscal Policy Institute. I see lots of friends in the audience and some sort of new ones. So just to sort of level set, as noted, we focus on the state budget, the economy, policy decisions, and as noted, really sort of narrowing in on low and moderate income individuals. Again, we do that by producing, disseminating independent research. And our goal really is to make sure that we're providing unbiased data analysis to policymakers, community leaders, journalists, and the general public. I want to sort of unpack policymakers. When we use that term, we're talking about not only state lawmakers, but the executive branch and folks that work in the agencies, because we know that they're really key to the policy development and also implementation phase, and something that, although if you work closely in Concord, you know that our state reps and state senators make $100 a year, but I think to your regular person, that doesn't really get through to them. And so we really do have a volunteer legislature. They don't have staff, they don't have offices. And so organizations like ours really help to make sure that they have the information they need, so public policy is grounded in fact. We don't lobby for or against legislation. Again, our purpose is just provide that information. We receive no funding from the state. I know sometimes some of my friends from out of state are like, Gene, doesn't your organization do stuff that a state government entity would do? And that is true. There are other organizations around the country that are actually a part of state government that do some of this work. We do have a legislative budget office that does some fiscal analysis, but they're really for the legislature, and they're limited in sort of some of the broader implications they do. All the funds that we use to operate come from individuals and foundations and organizations. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that today is part of New Hampshire Gives. And so, I was philanthropy is really important to New Hampshire and nonprofits. So if you haven't already made your gift to support some organization that you care deeply about or want to learn more about, feel free to do that before 5 o'clock today. That's my plug unauthorized there. And so also want to sort of highlight something that's important to note. We are happy to work with any member of the legislature, regardless of their party. And as sort of noted, we really are seen as really the nonpartisan folks that talk about the budget. So really, I think that's an important thing to note. So let's dive into economic security. I think it's important. This is a term that's used often by our elected leaders. And so let's sort of unpack it. I personally like the definition from the International Committee of the Red Cross. And it's really the ability of folks to cover their essential needs sustainably and with dignity. I really appreciate with dignity, as someone who was unhoused, who grew up in a family that really struggled to maintain economic security. I can tell you the work that we do at the organization, as well as my lived experience, this is really key. And that's, having it be sustainable. So it's not just 1 year we're having success, but sort of thinking of that through the long term. And as we look at some of the data in 2020, 2021, you'll see that folks were doing slightly better in those years. And then that sort of has changed as we've gone on. And we'll talk through maybe why that is the case and look forward to your questions on that. So let's dive into income and poverty. Normally I would do this and the next few slides would be Menti slides and be really engaging, but I think this is a smart and educated group. And so my guess is you kind of know that New Hampshire is ranked usually in the top 10, whether it's wealthiest states, richest states, highest, median household income. It's important to note, I generally am suspicious of some of the surveys that you see flowing around on the internet. No surprise there, but I think it's always important to look at methodology and what they're using. In this case, when you see some of these surveys, they're usually, some of these lists, they're talking about median household income. And so yes, New Hampshire's household median income is $90,000, nearly $9,000 in the last year available. And we generally rank in the top 10. And so when we look at poverty, it's true that New Hampshire has the lowest poverty based on the official poverty measure. And that's been pretty consistent over time, 7% of folks. Now, I think it's really important to pause on there because a lot of times, and again, there was, a national report released just recently that sort of touts New Hampshire having the lowest poverty in the nation. And that is true, right? That's factually accurate. But I think it's important to remember that that's 100,000 people in the state. And for those individuals, that superlative does not help them meet their basic needs, right? And so I think it's important to remember, while New Hampshire as a whole statistically has fewer folks in poverty as percentage than other states, I think it's important that we don't erase that and we really highlight and elevate the folks that are in poverty and the folks that are struggling to so I sort of note that. And so if you saw, I noted that 1 in 3 folks are struggling to meet their usual expenses. And so this comes from the Household Pulse survey. And what's important about this is that this is a survey that goes out monthly and it looks at this. You'll see that in 2022, 2023, this was about 33%. Again, you'll notice in 2021, there was a dip, and you see in the green bar all the way to the right that as of the first few months of the year, this was slightly down. In the most recent numbers, in the most recent months, we start to see this creep up. So we'll have to wait and to see, in the end of the year, if we're on track to sort of, again, 3 years in a row, be at about 1/3. But if you see some other information that's come out recently from, for example, the Boston Fed, they've shown that folks are really, we see credit card debt at its highest, and sort of folks are using that to be able to sort of make ends meet. And so again, there's a point where that ends and folks really start to be in trouble. So I sort of want to note that two things are happening at the same time. Yes, we have 7% of folks in poverty, but folks are reporting that 1 in 3 granite staters are struggling to meet basic expenses. So important to note. And again, as we think about sort of income groups here, I mentioned 90,000 folks is $9,000 is the median household income in the most recent year available. Important to note, about 1 in 4 have an income less than 50,000. So again, when we think about that, and in a few slides, we're going to talk about the cost of living and what that means. And so you'll see that, yes, in terms of rankings, we seemingly are doing well, but does that really connect where people are in their daily lives? I think it's important to note we talk about poverty a considerable amount. And so when we think about poverty in popular culture, we're talking about the poverty threshold and sort of official poverty. And so one thing I just sort of want to lift up here is that the official poverty measure, so when we think about poverty, and if you read in the news, this is what we're talking about. It's based off of a minimum food diet. And of course, there's multipliers for households, and sort of that's how it ramps up, as you can see on the chart on the right. This was established in the 1960s, and it's based off of food costs. And so if we think about what was going on in the 60s, and we think about prices from then today, yes, food, of course, has gone up. But we have to ask ourselves, does this make the most sense? The other thing I think it's important to note is that this is a pre-tax income, and it's the same in all 48 contiguous states. So this poverty threshold, if you have 2 adults and 2 children, this number is the same in New Hampshire as it is in California or Mississippi or Idaho, right? And so you have to ask yourself, does that make the most sense? Cost of living is different. There are different conditions in different places. Does it make sense to have this one unified measure for everyone, again, in the lower 48? And so there is another way we can measure poverty. The supplemental poverty measure is based off of recent expenditure data. It has estimates going back to 2029. And it includes sort of more things than just sort of food, as the official poverty measure shows. And so it includes taxes, tax credits, and what's really important here is regional household costs. And so you see, if you compare the chart that I just showed you to this one with 2 adults and 2 children, you see that geography matters, household type matters. If you look at the official poverty measure, it's the same, but you can look and you can see that the supplemental threshold changes. Again, that's not the same as what we know is needed for cost of living, but again, gets us closer to seeing what's going on. I'll note that in this presentation, when I refer to poverty, I'm talking about the official poverty measure, unless I mention specifically supplemental poverty measure. Okay, so let's take a look at the official rates. And in the next few slides, we're going to break down to sort of, we talked about poverty at 7%, but we're going to see what are the groups that are maybe disproportionately affected when it comes to poverty. And so if you see your green bar here is New Hampshire, your blue bar is the United States. And yes, if you see New Hampshire, we certainly have a lower poverty rate when we look at race and ethnicity. But I want to draw your attention to the different race and ethnic groups. For example, Black granite staters, much like nationally as a whole, see higher incidence of poverty rates. And again, if we think about systemic barriers to wealth and opportunity in this country, that makes sense why we continue to see that in terms of sort of outcomes. But I want to note that even though New Hampshire is wealthier, richer, whatever sort of word you want to ascribe to it, that we still don't have equal distribution of poverty among groups, right? And that's in theory, if all things were the same, that what you would see in a distribution, but that's sort of certainly not the case there. When we look at poverty rates by county, again, poverty rates are higher in the north and in the western part of the state. particularly Sullivan County, while more folks are in poverty in the Southeast, which makes sort of sense because our Hillsborough and Rockingham County are our most populous counties, right? That's where the center in terms of population is really located in New Hampshire, right? In that sort of southern triangle, if you will. But I want to draw your attention. A lot of folks talk about the North Country, but if you see, Coos County, almost 12% poverty rate. If we look over to Sullivan County, although, we're talking about a little over 4,000 folks, we certainly, again, almost have a 12% poverty rate. So poverty, again, by race and ethnicity, as well as location, we see sort of a difference in the number of people in the poverty rate by county. I want to drill down to sort of talk about a median household income for a little bit. And if you see here in the map of the state, your darker green has a higher median household income, and your lighter yellowish or beige, depending on your screen, is lighter side. And to sort of note this, Coos County's median is half that of Rockingham County. And we'll see in a few slides that cost of living is not half of that. And again, another way to look at this is per capita. Again, we continue to see the impacts of systemic racism in our country as it relates to these metrics. And again, New Hampshire is not unique. It's not, slightly better as a percentage, but still sort of by a factor of 2 in some areas, as we see. We talked about location in terms of county. We talked about sort of identity group. I want to talk now about household a little bit, what household type, and sort of who's leading those households. And so what we see in terms of housing type, homeowners, about a 3% poverty rate in homeowners, while that rate is around 13% when it comes to renters. Again, when we look at who's leading that household, single female households with children, we're talking about, a nearly doubling of that compared to their, male sort of counterparts there. And again, remember, 7% poverty statewide. But when we look at single female households who are renters, 26% are in poverty, right? So that we see sort of that baseline average, but as we unpack the numbers and look at different groups, we see that it's not the same across the board. And again, the chart on the right shows that. I wanted to sort of zoom out and look at the U.S. as a whole here, and really drill into sort of show some of the difference between the official poverty measure and the supplemental rate. You'll see that since its history, since we started to track it, your blue line is hovering above the green line. That changes in 2020 and 2021. And again, we'll talk about the direct impact to households in 2 slides. But you see that policy and direct aid to folks had a significant impact in curbing poverty, or sort of lowering it there. And you see, once those programs ended, were not renewed, you see poverty return to sort of the status quo. And so I think that's important to sort of visualize. Again, this is the US as a whole. Now let's look at New Hampshire. This is really interesting. Now, again, I run a research organization. Working on a PhD, so I kind of love a chart and graph. But this one I think is really fascinating because it shows a few different things. One that we kind of have a good sense of what it means, and then one that we're still trying to grapple with the implications. And so you see, this is a supplemental poverty measure in New Hampshire by age group. Okay, and so you see the orange line, which are kids here, and you see if you, in the last year or so, you probably, when this data was released, saw some headlines that talked about how child poverty was cut in half due to the child tax credit. Now, there were a number of things that were happening, but certainly most folks would say that the child tax credit, and again, this is a refundable tax credit that put, for the last 6 months of 2021, put money in people's pockets if you had kids, and it was broken down. The amounts were different depending on the ages there, but we see child poverty was cut in half in America. That was true in New Hampshire too. We went from about 21,000 kids in poverty to just above 10,000 kids in poverty. That number came up to around 19,000 in 2022. And so again, we see the policy implications happening there. One thing to note that we're still trying to sort of wrap our heads around is what's going on with the green line. And you see that these are seniors, and so poverty has gone up significantly in this population. And it's not completely clear to me what's going on with that. And I think we'll have to see another year to see if this is a trend or if this was a blip, right? If there was something that was going on. And so something to watch. New Hampshire is the second oldest state in the nation. So if we continue to see a spike in poverty among adults, there could be something going on, or that could be of note to policymakers. And again, as I mentioned, there was a significant amount of direct federal aid that occurred. We think about expanded unemployment compensation, food assistance programs. You had your economic impact payments, the stimulus checks, ERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which if you talk to folks on the ground who worked in agencies, they'll use the term transformative in terms of impacts to sort of help and stabilize families. Again, these programs ended. I talked a little bit about the child tax credits, and again, expanded access to healthcare, health coverage subsidies, again, really impactful in those years. And so we understand why the official poverty measure doesn't really change in those years, but we see supplemental does because it takes into consideration that. So we've talked a lot about poverty levels, and so now I want to switch to cost of living. There are a number of different folks that sort of look at estimates. We really like the Economic Policy Institute and the MIT's two calculators here. As you can tell from these numbers, if our median household income is $90,000 a year, right? So again, that's the midway point. Half of households make more than that, half are below that. And so if you see using their calculators, not a single county in terms of cost of living is in that range, right? So if you think about folks who are above that, depending on their income, could be having a place where they're being able to do well. But we see if you're below that median, chances are that you're probably not in the best financial situation, again, depending on these calculators. And again, they look at different methodologies. You can sort of dive deeper into them to see sort of what's driving them. But you're going to see that housing, childcare, and transportation are key drivers of the cost. And we're going to talk about childcare and housing towards the end. And I'm sure those would be a lot of questions that folks will ask about what's going on. I just want to note that some of the things that we hear sometimes, at least I'll say I hear folks ask us, is that, well, Gene, incomes certainly have gone up. So aren't people in a better position? And yes, of course, factually, median household incomes, as you see the green bar, has gone up. When we adjust for inflation to 2022 dollars, we see in 2021, 2022, that actually median income growth didn't exceed inflation, which again makes sense since the pandemic, if your wages have gone up maybe 10%, but your renter and your rent has gone up significantly. If you just bought a new house, right? Those are all implications that tell you that chances are, you're not doing as well as you would like to be doing. Again, one look at the wage distribution. Again, I think sometimes we get focused on what the median is. And again, here's what the hourly wage is by percentile. Again, this is in 2023. This is using some census data here. And so you see, if you're in the 90th percentile, chances are you're able to weather any challenges in inflation. If you are, we'll talk about childcare a little bit. Childcare workers are about 1550 here. So when they're on the lower end of this scale, provide a really important service. So, they might be in a more vulnerable position, right? Again, childcare workers, retail workers, we think about sort of folks who we know through our work at NHPI are at that end of the distribution. And again, wages certainly have not been as consistent, right? Sometimes they've outgrown inflation, sometimes they haven't. This chart's comparing 2019, you see the green, to 2021 when we think about 2023 wages, and you see that overall, since 2019, certainly wages and sort of are up, but in the private sector, but not so much in 2020 when we're sort of thinking about that. And again, if you're in professional and business services, great. Trades, transportation, utilities, or healthcare, education service, That's great. So again, we're seeing disparities there. Also want to sort of lift up sort of the cost of living. Again, this is sort of taking their numbers and sort of breaking into a pie chart of what it looks like. I'll note again, Rockingham County, Coos County on the right. This is 2 adults with 1 child. We see expenses. Again, this is an estimate for EPI's family budget calculator. But again, we see that folks are facing significant cost of living statewide and certainly in Coos County and Rockingham County. Okay, childcare. Here in New Hampshire, we've seen that childcare is a significant, if you're a family. I have a 5-year-old. We're excited for her to go to kindergarten next year. We also have a 2-year-old. And so when we talk about the cost of childcare, right, I think I certainly feel that very personally. Families are feeling that very personally. And so we've seen childcare prices go up. You probably see a statistic that, the cost for 2 kids in childcare, usually a toddler and an infant, is around $32,000. That's for center-based care. Again, even if you can afford that, there's a lot of accessibility issues. In addition to that, my colleague Dr. Nicole Heller, has done really great work, and so I encourage you to check out our website to sort of dive deeper into early care and education. And again, there's this federal benchmark. We often talk about 7% of a household income. That's not a number that we've determined. That's Health and Human Services has sort of determined that. And so if you see these charts below, you look at a married couple, it should be 7% of your household income. The numbers I just shared, if it was 7%, and again, you think about $32,000, 7%, you'd have to be making somewhere around $400,000 a year as a household to be able to hit that benchmark number. So you see married couples about 20% of their income, single male householder about 41%, 61% for single female householders. So again, if you have children, this is a significant driver of economic instability for you. Again, the state has a scholarship program. It's really a subsidy program. It's been expanded to 85% of the median income. So you see here, there's costs. I know I'm sort of running on time, so I'll sort of go through this. But again, this was expanded. Again, we've not seen a significant uptick, certainly an uptick, but there are some challenges to accessing the program. You see sort of what has been over the last few years. You see an uptick. A lot of folks don't know about it, or not all facilities accept the child care scholarship. So again, this just rolled out at the beginning of the year. And so again, policymakers are trying to grapple with childcare. This is a way that they're trying to do it. Again, we think about 85% of the median household. We know that that's less than half of families. And so again, folks that are still above that threshold could still be struggling with childcare costs. And we know that anecdotally that's true. Now, putting 2 things together, childcare and housing, we see that this equates. And again, we know that there are more recent housing numbers, but wanted to sort of keep, compare apples to apples here. And so if you're a median household and you maybe have a new mortgage, meaning you just recently bought a house and you have childcare, this is sort of the idea of what you're doing. And so you're talking about 44% of your income. This mortgage with taxes number, if you bought a house today, is probably closer to $4,000, right? So about $1,000 more. So you, again, sort of the changing that depends on how many kids you have and what center-based care you have. A lot of times folks ask about childcare investments. Our state, we have a federal sort of grant funded program, sort of the block grant comes through the state. We have to pay into that to be able to access and draw down those funds. You see in the orange that there was a significant amount of money that was invested in the state to stabilize the system. If you talk to childcare providers, they certainly will tell you that they're barely holding on, not to drive a fine point into it, but especially some of our, the ones in New Hampshire. The state in the darker green has invested $15 million in a one-time fund. And so that's being distributed now in other applications last year, but just important to note where the money's going. Again, $40 million added together in a budget of $15 billion, a little bit over that. It is not insignificant, but it's certainly not sort of, I think, what folks project that we need. Housing, again, been following it. It's been sort of mind-numbing to see the numbers. Again, since 2018, 66% increase statewide in that period of time. I know we bought our house in 2016. I did the math recently, and our mortgage, if we bought our same house today, based off of the interest rate and all this sort of things, we'd be paying about 176% more than we would in our monthly mortgage payment. So that's a real, again, obviously our incomes, folks' incomes in New Hampshire haven't gone up by that percentage. And so this is really a challenge for young families that are trying to sort of access home ownership. And again, I just sort of, we always like to look at the monthly average throughout the year. I think, in some months it could spike, it could go down based off of the inventory, but you see that there's price increases have happen as supply decreases, right? Fewer houses are for sale, which makes sense. Interest rates are high. Folks, if you're in a sub-3 interest rate, you probably don't want to go and get a 7 or a 5 if that's available. And again, we see at the same time, our vacancy rate has gone down. Our monthly rent and utility costs have gone up, right? There was a time where you could get an apartment 2-bedroom for about $1,000. That doesn't happen today, right? That's a challenge. It's about $1,700 the last time New Hampshire Housing put out data on that. And again, we see more folks are paying relatively high cost when it comes to their incomes, when it comes to housing. And so I'll note there have been a number of programs that have been put into place. They've largely expired, so it's using federal dollars. And again, sort of helping to sustain folks. Those have expired, and as we've seen the ramifications of those expirations. Again, the state budget, we've added more money to affordable housing. There's the New Hampshire, they Invest in New Hampshire Fund, the Housing Champions program that's really looking at zoning changes. And so we're going to see that. And again, of course, homelessness and housing shelters. So again, the state's seeing that, investing dollars into trying to address the housing crisis. I'll note that, this is an important chart looking at sort of what's the stimulus of these different, policies. And you'll note that when we put money directly into people's hands, it's used locally in the economy, and we see a higher return on investments than some other policy decisions. So again, we see the economics of this. It makes sense that these programs ought to be prioritized, and that's sort of what happened. We saw in 2021. Just sort of key takeaways I want to end with is that poverty rates, yes, are lower than other states, but the median household income is $90,000, but still households are struggling to afford their usual expenses. We see that inflation has obviously grown since the COVID pandemic, and it's not evenly distributed among industries. And we saw poverty obviously redouble as rebound as federal support expired. Again, childcare and housing, those are just two areas that I focus on in the limited time that we have, but we see that's a huge driver for budgets, particularly for younger families. Again, we're an aging state. We want more folks to live here in New Hampshire. And so we see one-time programs ending, and we continue to see low-income folks struggle, but we see that aid being an effective stimulus. Again, additional resources, you can visit our website, and I encourage you to follow us on Facebook, join our newsletter, and look forward to the conversation.
This is really fantastic, Jean. Thank you. Like Peter Burdett says in the chat, we need some more time with these charts. Absolutely. I encourage you to visit the Fiscal Policy Institute webpage, and we will also have these slides available on the Carsey site by the end of the week, because there is just so much good information here. Jean, before we dive into the issues, I did want to harken back to your MPA program, graduate of 2020. What was your favorite moment or biggest takeaway from the Carsey MPA program?
Thanks for the question. And, I think for me, I really loved all of it. I thought, I loved my undergraduate experience, but I loved the ability to work in sort of my years. There were a number of working professionals. So, a big town fire chief and, a town manager, as well as folks who were working at different levels of nonprofit leadership and in government. And it really helped to sort of, for me, build a network and to be able to work with folks even to this day to sort of share ideas around. And I think, whether you lead a nonprofit or work in an area, having that community is so important. Of course, I love particular classes and professors who really just help to shape me and be so supportive. But I think it's that community that really I appreciated more than anything, and to sort of go through the program and meet new folks and know that we're all trying to do our best in the state. And so I say that community was really impactful to me.
Yeah, we love having people like you in the program who are bringing sort of professional, personal experience and then just taking it to the next level. Again, you're doing fantastic work in, in really quantifying the economic and fiscal impacts of many of these social policies and guiding legislators. I was curious about the supplemental poverty measure in particular. It seems such a better guide than the official policy measure, as you noted. And what do you think it would take for that measure to become more deeply embedded or frequently used across state and federal decision making?
I certainly think that folks, I think when I read, sort of news articles, I think, and sort of read publications, you're certainly seeing that tick up. I think folks wanted to give it some time, but I think, policymakers have to focus on that. If we think about, unemployment, and now I'm really, nerding out here, but we think about unemployment, when we think about that number, the official number is U3, right? And folks pay attention to that because that's usually what's reported. But a lot of folks will look at U6, which is sort of marginally attached folks to the workforce, and so to be able to better understand that. But I think, for us, it's sort of looking at what matters. And I think poverty as a threshold, folks get really caught up in. But I think if we take a step back, if we look at, are folks struggling to meet their daily expenses, right? And if that, to me, is the real metric, how can we help address that? So yes, I think, policymakers, governments could make it, right, the official poverty measure if they wanted to, but I think even using that, it probably still doesn't capture what folks are really facing in the country, and certainly in New Hampshire.
Right. Thank you. You've touched on a number of big topics. They're all intersectional, right? And so I can go through them sort of topic by topic. I see that, for example, in childcare, where my colleague Jess Carson has also done a lot of work. I believe you're in the same meeting this afternoon. I'm looking at the pie chart of Coas County versus Rockingham County. And even within, one of Jess's recent briefs showed that even within the working families, there's much less that's being spent on childcare in lower income households. So, despite the need for childcare across these different working families, the access seems to be much less. And I wonder if you could speak to efforts to increase accessibility to childcare, in whether in supply, or you mentioned some of the subsidization programs, but how do we restart the engine so that more families can work, knowing that their children are in safe and educational environments?
Absolutely. And so I think I'll start off by noting that, and again, this number changes every year because it's survey data, so it's always changing when folks are being surveyed. But around 16,000 folks report here in New Hampshire that they would be in the workforce if not, if they had access or if they weren't caring for a child. So again, we think about New Hampshire, we're an aging population. Every business you talk to is struggling to find workers, and so that's 16,000 people that we're keeping on the sidelines for access to childcare. And again, it's certainly more acute. I happen to know someone who, after 2 years of being on a wait list, is finally accessing childcare. Right, that individual lives on the seacoast, and you hear those stories. I'll say, when we had our daughter just turned 2, and we live in Manchester, and there was a childcare facility that we put her name in before she was even born. And at that time, they were telling us that probably fall of 2025, she was born in 2022, 2025, that there might be a spot. And so the access, even if you can afford it, it's usually an access challenge. Folks are driving to different places, but certainly it's challenging. And we think about it, we have spots, again, this varies through center and geography, but we know that some of the challenges, the workforce, and as I sort of mentioned, um, early child care workers, it's a very important job. We're talking about the fundamentals of teaching young kids, right? I think gone are the days of this thought of like, these are just daycare workers. They're just, watching kids, right? There's a lot of early education that's happening. And we saw the research really impacts them on a lifelong basis. And so it's really important. So we're seeing that the workforce, it's sad, but you could probably work at a big box store and make more than in childcare, right? So you think about childcare entities are facing a number of challenges, but one of them is the fact that they struggle to attract and retain workers. A lot of these folks, they're not able to be offered retirement benefits or health care. And again, wages are low, even though the costs are high. So there's a number of challenges. And I think the state's looking at that, but this is a long-term care problem. The child, providers would tell you, and as they tell me, folks maybe have started to pay attention to this more since the pandemic, but they would tell you that the crisis was brewing long before the COVID pandemic. And so I think policymakers really have to look at the access to that and what that means, particularly if more individuals are staying out of the workforce because of that.
Well, the questions are starting to come in fast and furious, including a small debate in the chat about caps on rental prices. So Savannah has asked, is there any feasible solution to the housing crisis currently? She noticed with the slides that the housing costs have risen and we're 51% of income, which is just huge. Legislative actions that can be taken, a cap on rent. And Peter says, never caps on rents.
Yeah. And so I think, there's a few things to look at, I want to note the work that we do at the Fiscal Policy Institute. Really, it's a team effort, right? Of course, of the folks on our staff, but partners like Jess Carson, in early care and education. But I want to note sort of our friends at New Hampshire Housing, and they have incredible resources that talk about sort of the vacancy rate. And so I think if we think about this at a larger level, some of the challenges is the fact that we have not kept up with the demand of building houses. So, right, so it's a supply challenge. You see the vacancy rate after the Great Recession. We saw a dip in employment in terms of residential home construction. Compared to, for example, we looked at 2004, and that still was lower up until about last year, so about 3% compared to that year. And what's important to note is that houses weren't being built. They at New Hampshire Housing show that by 2030, that we probably, again, that was 2020, 2030, probably need about 60,000 new units built. And again, by 2040, we need about 90,000 units. So that's sort of, I think, the challenge, right, is that we don't have as much supply. And so because of that, you have prices that are able to be increased, or you have people who are beating people and outbidding them. I'll also note that when we think about New Hampshire, we're an aging population. I don't mention long-term care in this sort of deck, but certainly we think about where older adults go, right? And so we see more folks who sort of the boomers and and up, as they age, they seem to be staying in their homes in a way that they previously might have been going into an apartment and freeing up some supply. And so one, it's the lack of building, folks sort of aging in place there. And again, St. A's, which has done great work on zoning, is a real challenge. There are some communities that don't want to build housing, and that really affects what can go on. And so if you see some other states in the country where there's again, this is a local issue, and I think advocates are trying to sort of move forward on that front to allow for more homes to build. So there's no silver bullet. It's a multifaceted problem. But if you have a small community that refuses to build sort of not only single family homes, but sort of this missing middle that folks often talk about, it's a real challenge. So I know I'm not giving specific policy solutions, but there's so much that could be done. But part of it is certainly building, and it's looking at what can be done and where those folks are. Manchester, for example, where I live, has, I think it's almost 2,500 units that either have been built or will be built in the next 2 years. That's not happening in some smaller towns. And so I think folks have to sort of take that locally and make those changes.
Right. And Jess Carson echoes in the chat everything that you've said about the long-term issues connected to workforce. And she calls out you and Phil and Nicole as critical partners. So thank you for that. You mentioned in the presentation and just recently the spike in senior poverty. And Pete again talked about interest rates and energy rates, especially being higher and really affecting seniors in this way around rent. And, there wasn't, you didn't touch on in this brief presentation, the impact of climate equity and decarbonizing the affordable rental housing stock. How much in your work are you looking at the intersection of climate and energy on economic and fiscal policy issues? And if you could also reflect on the attention that the legislature seems to be putting on that.
Absolutely. And so we, as an organization, don't talk as much about energy policy. I'll sort of note that, there are billions of dollars that likely will come into the state as a result of sort of energy projects. And I think the state has been somewhat slow to move in this regard. There's been lawsuit settlement dollars that only recently they were starting to grant out to build this. And so I'll note, New Hampshire, particularly certain places up north, depend on tourism as part of their industry. And when we think about what other states are doing in the EV space, for example, we're not seeing that infrastructure built out. And I'll tell you that businesses certainly have approached us and sort of wanting us to talk more about it because they see that as a key challenge to fight for those dollars as well as sort of building. And so I do, as we think about, particularly renters, we think about low and moderate income individuals, there was a time where the rates for utilities, particularly electricity, doubled, in 2022 and 2023. It wasn't the full calendar year, but that had a real impact on people. I know certainly, right, we could see our electric bill double. And so we think about folks who might not have the resources to cope with that. That puts them in sort of a cascading position. So, I think policymakers, there's lots of interesting things going on with community power, and I think we'll have to see how that plays out. But, one of the really exciting things about policy work is that we have 50 states. And so really, we talked about the laboratory of democracy. And so we're seeing other states really lean in on this. We've not seen the legislature move, but again, we're going to see a considerable amount of federal dollars from sort of bills that have been passed in the last few years that come into the state. So we have the opportunity for transportation, for example, to really build up infrastructure and sort of how do we build out EVs? Because my guess is folks who come up from Massachusetts or other places to sort of hike our trails, right, are going to be interested in that capacity. So I want to make sure that New Hampshire isn't missing out on that. And so we'll have to keep looking to see how that impacts us, but certainly an important issue as we move forward, particularly for low and moderate income families.
Right, and you mentioned community solar. We looked at the coalition as well as how other community solar arrays can help with housing affordability back in March, if listeners would like to go back and check out that Carsey Policy Hour. I challenge you to pick a big topic. You have two questions that are connected to that macro view of this question. One from Donna is, could population growth be causing the higher cost of living? And also number two from Yulia, what do you see as a key way to change the paradigm of wealth distribution and create more equality? And she prompts universal healthcare, childcare, and universal childcare.
Absolutely. So when we look at population growth, one, we had an hour to sort of talk through, you would have saw another 20 to 30 slides sort of breaking this down. But I'll say population growth, this is a common sort of question that we get. New Hampshire, if you look at the birth rates versus the sort of the folks who die, right? We're in a negative space when it comes to that. So New Hampshire is only growing in its population because of migration, right? So folks moving into New Hampshire, and certainly there is this sense that folks are maybe buying homes, right? They're from maybe, Massachusetts or some other place, and they're able to sell their home and move here. So there's certainly that, but it's affecting everywhere, right? Again, so I think you could say most folks who move into the state are moving on the southern border of the state. We've seen, right, that if you think demographics, right, that's changed dramatically. And we think about Salem and Windham and Pelham and those sort of communities that sort of change over. So that certainly could be at play there. But I'll say our economy depends on folks. We're the second oldest state in the country. We tie with two other places, but statistically the oldest. And so we need folks that are able to work. So our economy depends on population growth, but certainly, housing has gone up nationally. If we look at other states, right, we're not unique to that. Certainly it's more acute in some areas, but, I think it's a mixed bag. If we think about population growth, do we want to go to a point where we start declining in population? What does that mean for businesses? Do businesses leave because they can't find workers? I'll tell you that national or international organizations that have locations here in New Hampshire often tell me that they lose out on internal projects because we don't have the workforce here in New Hampshire. The other thing I'll note is that around 56% of our high school graduates who go on to pursue college or sort of post-secondary leave the state, right? So we see this brain drain that happens in New Hampshire in a way that it doesn't happen in Maine. It's only 36% of folks in that same demographic leave, right? And so I think about people who leave and they want to come back to live here and raise their family. Buying a house that's $500,000, chances are they're not able to afford it. So I think, we'll have to sort of, look. I wish, Ken was in the audience with us and sort of could talk about that. He's really a population expert in demographics, but I do think it's, mixed in that regard. But if it weren't for folks moving in, would be a challenge. And I'll say that migration, if you look at New Hampshire as a whole, we have some of the lowest native born, right, New Hampshire born folks in the country. And so I think, we've really survived as a state by people moving into the state and benefiting, frankly, from Massachusetts. And I'll say this because, we can't have a study where we take New Hampshire out of, its location, put it where Idaho is. But if you look at our population growth and some of the wealth, it certainly is connected to sort of southern New Hampshire becoming essentially a bedroom community of Boston. So we certainly have benefited sort of from our economy and through other areas. And the next question, so thanks, I think, Donna, for that question. And I think you mentioned the income inequality. I'll just sort of note that we look at this, and I think it's important to note that, I talked about income from the median household income. There's other ways that folks bring in income, and I'll just sort of note some quick stats here that when we look at filers, this is IRS data, and I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but when we look at filers who report more than $1 million in income in New Hampshire, that rose by about 51% between 2020 and 2021. And income rose almost 100% of that, folks. And so when we see the increase of income between 2020 and 2021, those are the most recent IRS data available, most of that is in high income earners. And we also know that if you look at the bottom 20% of folks who pay state and local tax here in New Hampshire, and look at the top 1%, that sort of, again, percentage wise, we talk about 3 times the amount of state and local tax paid by those at the lower end of the scale compared to the higher end of the scale. So certainly more of their limited income is going towards taxes, and that's really property tax. Whether you own a home or not, if you rent, you're paying property tax. You're just not paying it directly, right? You're paying the landlord. And so we see that sort of income disparities that have happened, and that's has been consistent for quite a long time.
Questions on the brain drain, and I believe Laurel will be posting a link to a Carsey Policy Hour with Stayworks Place Will Stewart, who has answers to questions of why and how much and what we can do to keep and bring back young people. Savannah also is talking about the housing supply and just this very important piece of raising supply, which of course it's a free market economy, so we have to work multiple levers to be able to do that. I'm curious about the policy making process, and of course, the legislature isn't the only part of government that sets public policy. And we have someone from New Hampshire Housing on the webinar today. And George, if you, your Director of Community Engagement of New Hampshire Housing, if you would even put in the chat some of the issues or questions that are top of mind for you, I think that would be very interesting. But Jean, I wanted to ask you about the demographics of the legislature compared to the demics across the state. I imagine that 26% of legislators do not make less than $50,000 a year. There are a number of middle income, full-time workers who are supporting families and making time to essentially volunteer their time in the legislature. So I don't want to minimize it or paint the legislature as, all wealthy retirees. But there is this difference in the composition. So I wonder if you could speak to that, and also perhaps best practices you've seen in legislators who are trying to bring what they might not see around them or in their personal experience or their personal circles into their policy making.
Absolutely. And so when we look, again, I mentioned $100 a year, right? So it's chance most of the legislature is older. They're retired, or they're independently wealthy, or they have the privilege of having a really flexible job where they can spend 3 days a week, one or two in committee, depending on the committee they're on, and then obviously in session. So we see an older population. And I'll say, based off of conversations that I've had with folks in both parties, is that, if you're in your 60s or 70s and you purchased your house in the 80s or 90s, you're living in a very different time period, right? There, I was talking to a member of the legislature who asked me about childcare. Why aren't more folks just like staying home to take care of their kids? And I told the representative, like, you just can't afford to do that, right? Like, you can't, I can't, my wife's a teacher, I guess I could stay home and quit my job and watch my 2 kids, but like, how would we afford things? And so I think that's sort of helping folks to understand that. And being a volunteer legislature, these folks are in the community. And so I always encourage people to reach out and like have coffee with your member, whether it's a House member, you could have multiple ones, it could be your state senator, because I'll say they get a lot of, having worked in an office, they get a lot of form letters. And so I think when they get a phone call from someone, or they see someone in the grocery store, that really sticks with them. And talk to them about your situation, what you are feeling, right? Make it really personal, and ask them, like, what are they going to do about it? Because I always come from the idea that these folks are good people. They're trying to do their best for the state, but they have to know the challenges. And it's important for us to have those conversations with them and really ground policy in facts and information, and knowing that, again, the situation, right? Imagine if today they were buying a house and their mortgage was $4,000 a month, right? Think about the income you need to sustain that in a sustainable way. So I think for a lot of folks, it's making that case. And again, that's sort of a barrier to our legislature that we have. But in the other hand of it, you have folks that are really in community, and in my experience, receptive to having those conversations. So I always encourage people to have those individual conversations and tell their story, and ask them what they're planning to do about it.
Eugene, this has been tremendous. We're already at the hour. I wanted to give you this platform around New Hampshire Gives to recommend one nonprofit that our audience should learn more about and perhaps donate to today. One nonprofit, and why?
Well, thanks. I would say, of course, I don't want to say NHFPI, but of course, we welcome donations there. But, I think, I'd recommend New Hampshire Civics. They're a great organization, a great new leader who's a dear friend of mine. And their mission is to really help students understand government. And I think some of the challenges that we have in our state and our country is that folks don't have a good understanding of the policy issues, and they're doing a great job through a number of different programs to uplift that. So New Hampshire Civics would highly recommend you all supporting them.
Hampshire Civics and the Fiscal Policy Institute and Carsey. Thank you, Jean. We are putting together a fantastic lineup for the fall Carsey Policy Hour series, featuring new Carsey research, our smart and active partners like the Fiscal Policy Institute, an introduction to our incoming director, Stephen Bird, and of course, an eye on the November elections. We'll be releasing the fall schedule next month. For now, pencil in September 11th, the second Wednesday of the month, as always, for our next session. Thank you, Jean. Thank you all. Have a good summer.